Hey everybody, it's Ian. Welcome back to Intro to Folklore. Today we're talking about folk narrative, which might be a bit of a relief because we're finally talking about things. We've been talking about groups so much, ethnic groups and the concept of group and the relationship between group and their stuff, that we haven't really been talking about stuff. And when you're signing up for a folklore course, probably one of the first things that you're thinking about is, I'm going to hear some stuff. And you're not really today, but we're going to be sort of directing you in that general area because we want to sort of talk about the nature of stories. Folklorists study these things. I mean, any folklorist is going to just simply by the nature of the history of the discipline, is going to be able to talk to you somewhat about traditional narrative. Whatever we want to call traditional narrative at any given moment, it's just so embedded in the discipline. It's embedded in the discipline in terms of that was one of its touchstones about what got collected in the 19th century. It's one of the first things we think about. We being the regular Joe in the street thinks about when they think about folklore. They think about tale and they think about myth and legend and so on, and they think about storytellers and storytelling as an art and as a craft, and so, I mean, just by professional necessity, a folklorist is going to be able to talk about narrative. And when we talk about narratives, we're not simply talking about these things that have happened in this past, the stories that have some kind of almost antediluvian or time depth to them, that they are stories that have always been. We do talk about those, although we'll really push back on that idea that they have always been. But we certainly talk about inherited texts, but the same techniques to study something like Cinderella, the same techniques to study something like religious mythological storytelling that one might come across in Western societies and in non-Western societies. That those same techniques you're going to be talking about when you're going to be referencing when we talk about contemporary stories like contemporary legend, and when we talk about stories that are our own, that they're not some inherited plot that we get from someone else, but when I tell my story, when I'm telling something that actually happened to me, that isn't a story in as much as it's a fabrication, and all of these things we're going to be talking about. But when I when I am communicating to you something in my experience, and I'm communicating it to you through the vehicle not simply of words, but words in a particular order that have a logic that is commensurate with how you understand events to unfold, and an aesthetic, and how you think a story ought to sound, those techniques of composition, those techniques of structure, those techniques of me understanding your expectations for story and therefore communicating it thusly, are the same as are present at these times, in traditional storytelling. So it's incredibly central to the discipline. And one of the things that we need to remember is that we can't really disentangle story from storytelling. We can't really remove the process of how these things are communicated from the texts that are communicated. Because when two people get together and one of them assumes the role of storyteller, two or more people get together and one or more assumes the role of storyteller, and the rest assume the role of story audience, they have an expectation for that performance. They have an expectation for that performance based on, well, when it is. Sunday morning, you're going to be hearing a different kind of story than a Saturday night. After work, you're going to be hearing a different kind of story than you are in the meeting room. And other expectations, like the relationship between the people who are present, and the relationship between the storyteller and the story audience. Grandma, grandkids, different kind of story than old rugby team fellows. But nevertheless, the structure is basically the same. The teller and the audience probably know each other to a certain extent, or have an intelligent understanding of their relationships, even if their relationship is not personal. So if you go into a live context and some storyteller comes in from out of town, they have some kind of understanding of the audience that they're going to be speaking to, and the audience has some kind of understanding of the teller. Even if they don't know the person, they might know the type of person. And so it's like, I have expectations for this kind of performance, and this is someone who says that they do this kind of performance, so I have kind of expectations of this. Now, those expectations might be, I have the expectation for a specific plot. We only have like 15 stories in our community, and this teller tells one of them very well. And so every time they get together, they're going to tell the story. And sometimes the expectation is going to be on novelty. It's like, I'm going to be amazed. I will not know what this person is telling, but I still have expectations on how they're going to tell it. This comes in, my work is on stand-up. And so, I mean, when you go to a stand-up venue, even if you do not know the stand-up comedian, you have an understanding of what stand-up is. Now, humorous, joke telling or humorous anecdotes, that almost always implies some kind of surprise. Like, I did not see that coming. And so you don't know the actual story, but you still have the expectations of, even if you can't articulate them, you have the expectations of how a stand-up performance is going to go. So that's the kind of thing that you're dealing with. Let's go back to some basics. Let's talk. I'm going to focus most on fairy tale, because fairy tale is one of the best examples of it. Now, fairy tale, you probably have a good working understanding of what that is, but I'll just sort of throw in a couple of extras. Fairy tale is that special area of traditional narrative that typically involves a unlikely hero achieving some kind of, or fulfilling some kind of task that was set out for them. Sometimes they set it out for themselves, where they redressed some kind of wrong. A lack is liquidated, a villainy is undone, and they're unlikely, and through a variety of working through a variety of characters, working through interactions with other people, working against other people, demonstrating particularly socially important traits like cunning or bravery or thrift or generosity or a whole bunch of things. They progress through that narrative. They fulfill, and they're typically rewarded. And one of the ways that they're typically rewarded is through being granted full adult status, that they are independent. They typically become like the head of a household. It's why fairy tales end in weddings. It is in marriages. It's not that the princess idea is like this notion of they're all sort of very banal romances. It's the idea that was the marking in most times in history of someone having achieved some kind of independence from their parents, and with princess in terms of like obviously financial and political independence from their earlier circumstances. So the princess narrative ends in that, and then we have the sort of technical thing, which goes back to some of the history. One of the things that people were interested in as a mathematical question is how did these stories spread, and how do these stories, where do these stories originate? And they had this idea. They had this idea that there was an original version, that similar to how the same time over the 19th century, language was being sort of traced back, Indo-European language is being traced back to that Proto-Indo-European language. The idea that basically all of European languages and much of Indian languages and Semitic languages and so on emerged as like one unified at one point in like northern India, several millennia ago, and then you sort of branch out, and if you have all these language traces, you can kind of follow through. And so this language sort of branched out into these two, and that sort of formed its own thing, like sort of the more Grecian oriented languages, the Slavic languages, and this one sort of entered into the Germanic languages, and this one entered into the Latin languages, and so on, and branch. it's an interesting theory. And the question is like, well, maybe stories work the same way. And so this vast collecting exercise took place to basically try and find absolutely every traditional narrative that they could. And this was a Finnish endeavor more than anything. The Finnish, the historic geographic method, just find everything and then see how it spreads, and then like sort of like a DNA analysis. You go back and trace the roots, and you'll find it and narrow it down, and we'll find the original version. And the original version was sort of proven to be kind of like a bull jive idea. But what we did discover, we discovered a lot of things. First, there was this massive index that was done, the Tale Type Index by Antti Arn, which was then adopted by Stith Thompson and translated into English, and then expanded a couple of times, and that became this numbering system for the traditional international tale, which would give massive amounts of evidence of here is a story, and here's the same basic plot, and the same basic plot is available in a host of different places. You can find it here, you can find it here, you can find it here. Here's where it's elemental. Here are the motifs that are associated with it. And Stith Thompson then also went to do the motif index. But going back to the Tale Type Index, it was expanded and revised again about 15 years ago by Hans-Jörg Uther, and now we call it the ATU, the Arn Thompson Uther Index. And basically all tales, of which fairy tales are a subset, all tales have this number associated with them. And so we can, basically it's a way of sorting. And it's a very useful thing. Because at the same time that this was happening, or once this index was basically compiled, people were noticing it's like, well, finding this original version is not necessarily useful or productive or necessary. But what we are seeing is that these are basically examples, very rife examples. So we can legitimately say that they are international, but very rife examples on how tales are constructed. And so for the folk tale particularly, Vladimir Prop, who is a Russian structuralist, maybe he's a Russian formalist, I always get those two confused, but anyway, he's a Russian. He took the fairy tale, which was Arn Thompson number 300 to 749, and then he used a couple others in the 800 range because they're fairy tales, but they don't necessarily have magic associated with them. I think he called them like novellas. He said these are all basically the same structure. They're all basically the same, and that, again, what I just said, the hero goes out, some kind of villainy is announced, the hero goes out to redress it, and through thrift, through demonstration of traits, through bravery, that is fixed, and he emerges from his social status. So they fundamentally recognize that these are the rules for how to construct a story. That they are, they're not necessary, they're not psychological, it's not one of those weird Jungian things where this is how the brain tells us to tell a story, but they're quite logical, and they make an awful lot of sense for this particular kind of story, for this emancipatory story. And so we have this idea of the version and the type, because we might have this sort of deep set of expectations for a story. This is what a fairy tale is. But then we have expectations we have this thing called Cinderella. We just have it. It's there. It's attested to. Whether we call her Aschenputtel, whether we give her a different name, it's the same basic thing. The unloved stepdaughter in this family lives by the ashes. She's very beautiful. She's very modest. She's basically working as a servant for her new family. There's a night of balls. She's able to go thanks to the help of some magical agents. She meets a prince, but while she is in disguise, the prince searches out, and usually through the test of a shoe, her true identity is discovered, and she marries. Almost coughed, didn't cough. So we have this thing, and we have this listing as the type 510A in the Arn Thompson Uther Index, and it's the thing. It is not inviolate. It doesn't exist save for the fact that we have seen this pattern in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things. But that pattern is basically the world's expectation for this particular story. Now, it's a set of expectations. It means you can mess with it. It means you can be very conservative or very dynamic with it. It means that it becomes this almost, I'll go so far as to say, almost this canonical framework that you can make a fair estimate guess that your audience knows, and then you, as you're telling the story, they're seeing this sort of the familiarity, and then they're seeing the artistry that you bring to it. And so we have this idea of type and version. And type is this thing. It's the pattern. It is the expectations. And I like to think of it is that it is what the knowledge that we bring to a storytelling event, or any kind of folkloric event, but we're talking about stories or a storytelling event. It's the knowledge that we bring to it. It's the expectations that I as a teller and you as an audience bring to it. Now, of course, you might be new to a culture. You might be new to a culture that doesn't, and your previous culture doesn't have Little Red Riding Hood. You might be a year, or Cinderella. You might be a year and a half old and have yet to learn your culture. That's fine. There's always new, but it's in the main, this is it. And so sometimes I'm telling you the story knowing that you don't know it, and I'll be very sort of full, like you got to hear this story. Sometimes I'll tell the story knowing that you do know it, or I'll tell the story knowing that some people in the audience know it and some people in the audience don't know it, and that's the intelligence that the storyteller brings. And we can do that with tale, but we can do that with anything. Tale is just a great example of it, but we can do it with food. We have this type inversion. We have this meal. We have this expectation. Certain events have certain expectations associated with them. So we can think of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving in Canada has a kind of set of expectations about it. And so you're probably going to see a turkey. You're probably going to see one, if not more, varieties of potatoes. It's probably going to be at the good table. You're probably going to break out the good linen, and you're probably going to break out the good plates. You're probably going to dress a little bit better. It's probably going to be at a weird time, like 4, a time that no one eats. But this, and as you go from house to house in Canada, you're probably going to come across this pattern, and then you might have like sort of subtypes of it, where you have like the Atlantic Canadian one, or maybe you have a Cape Breton one, then you have your family ones, and so on, and these are going to be distinct. And what is more, you're going to have your family one, and you're going to have your family one this year, and your family one this year is meeting the expectations, that type of this is what McCarthy family Thanksgiving is. And this is how it's going to be manifested in 2021 or 2030 or 2080, or how it was manifested in the 1890s or whatever. And then that becomes part of the experience, and then the next one is going to modify. And so it's not a set of rules, it's a set of expectations. And so it can be played with. Oh, Jenny's a vegan now, or Grandpa can't have salt anymore, so that's changing everything. But you can still, all right, how do I do this? How do I work this? And you have this thing. So type and version are incredibly important folkloric concepts to grasp, because it is the general set of expectations for this particular thing, where this particular thing can substitute for almost any kind of deliberate creative act. And version is how it is manifested at any given moment. And what's important to think about is that every single instance, every single version is legitimate. That there is no hierarchy of these types, of these versions, because some are going to be more conservative but conservatism is a value that is being brought to performance. It is not an inherent quality unless the group thinks of it as an inherent quality. They are so you can legitimately look at mass-mediated versions of a tale in the same way that you can look at what you imagine to be the most authentic. You find the oldest person that you know, and you ask them to tell the oldest story that they know, and you want it in the most authentic conditions as possible. So you get it like around a hearth or something. That's cool. That can happen, but that's not necessarily any more authentic than any other version. And it's a good thing to think about, because one of the things that we need to dispel is the idea that older is necessarily more authentic. older does not necessarily mean more authentic, because the idea of more authentic is not a concept that we can even grasp, because it's a fallacious concept. But because authenticity is a subjective quality. If you think that this is the way it ought to be done, then it is the way it ought to be done, because you are not beholden to the tradition, save for how you choose to use it. But you need to push back but what's the original version? It's like, well, I can clearly, for back to fairy tale, I can clearly show you older forms, and these are forms that have been highly influential, and I'm not going to dispel that as a historical marker, but the reason that they are highly influential is because of the many versions that might have been in circulation at any given moment. They were plucked out and sort of given the privilege of entering into the written tradition, which is how we got so many of these. And entering into written tradition does change the dynamics somewhat, because it gets the benefit of the fixity of text. And the second thing is that we don't necessarily know, and sometimes we actually do know, but we don't necessarily know the editorial stance of the person who committed it to this text. And like, did they fix it? Did they make it better? Under what criteria did they make it better? And that's a pretty heady subject to consider. So, version and type. Now we want to go back and thinking about narrative in particular. We got to sort of think of what is the context of a narrative. And, it is a verbal, for the most part, although we can clearly talk about other forms, an account of some kind of event or another, where the event or events, the events usually imply some kind of actors, that if they are not human, then they are acting in human kind of ways. There's typically some kind of event. I mean, the event implies that that something changes. There's often an initial situation, even though that might be implied. Then there is something that changes that situation, and then sometimes there is a thing that fixes that change or addresses that change, and things move forward. It's typically told in an order, and that order is, for the most part, chronological. This happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. It's told in a much more dynamic way than the story that I just related. But, it's usually that. There are genres that withhold some kind of information. So it's like, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened for some reason. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And then, it happened for that reason, because I have found out in the interim that this happens. Oh, okay. But for the, so mysteries are basically, they play with a chronology, a detective fiction or something, because at the very end you find out something that someone found out earlier, or a connection is made that was obscured, is now clear, and so on. But we're talking, traditional narratives are almost resolutely chronological, because they're not really there to inspire a huge amount of wonder and mystery, because they're wonder, yes, mystery perhaps, yes, but not confusion that is going to then be redressed. In traditional narrative, one of the things that we can come across when we look, if you ever want to examine folk literature more in greater depth, is that everyone's cards are on the table. The evil people are evil the entire time. The good people are good the entire time. There's not a huge amount of character development. The character might age, but the character is always good, and it's just is proven good again and again. There's not a huge amount of nuance, for reasons that we can get into. Excuse me, there we go. Now, as I said, these same rules work for stories that are resolutely true as they are for resolutely false, or rather fictions. I mean, if I'm telling my story, I'm going to be using the same basic kind of structure. I'm telling a story about me. I might be referring to the character in this story in the first person, where I did this, I did this, I did this. But basically, I'm creating a character of myself, and I'm trying to sort of make arguments how it works. There's this issue about whether the relationship between truth and falsehood, of course, gets very fuzzy when we start thinking about particular kinds of narrative. When we start thinking about sacred narrative, whether things that and I'm going to start talking about terms, but things that anthropologists and folklorists would refer to as myths. Stories that are understood within sacred contexts, within certain performance contexts, as fundamentally true. They actually happened. If they hadn't happened in this way, you and I would not be here. And that might be mythic in terms of the way you might understand it, in terms of like the intervention of supernatural actors, supernatural agents. The creation of the world. Creation myths are one of the big areas that folklorists are interested in. That folklorists apply the term myth to, and that they are so extraordinary that they push credibility, and yet in order to be in a group, you have to find them credible. That we are well aware of how extraordinary that they are. The whole basis of our existence is we are the result of extraordinary actions by extraordinary beings. So we have that, and now that same story we can retell in a situation where it's like, this is a great story, but it's no longer necessarily active in this community in the same way. So we might think of things like Viking myths or Greek myths. We might look at the Bible as literature. We might do all these sorts of things. And we say, these are still great stories. They're fantastic stories. We don't hold them as being actual accounts of actual events that happened in real time. But we find them, at the very least, we find them entertaining. Maybe we find them informative. Maybe we find them motivating. But we're not putting them in the same realm as history. And that's okay, because I'm not saying that we can't take stands on this. I'm saying that the method of storytelling is often remarkably the same. So you can look at not necessarily the entire structure, but you can certainly look at elements of Western religious writing and see motifs that are very much, I hate to say it, I won't use the word fairy tale because fairy tale has this derogatory sense, but Märchen, this wonder tale, where the hero sets out and does these things. The Moses story is very much interrelated with the fairy tale structure in terms of the unlikely hero who is set out, or he has this noble birth, and then it's made humble and in the reeds, and then he becomes an apprentice, and he becomes basically the adopted son, and he rebels, and blah 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 blah. It's like that's a fairy tale structure, isn't it? And I can say that without denigrating the belief in that story. At least I hope I can. I believe I can. But we do distinguish these stories in many ways. We'll have this. One of the things that we talk about are these three major genres of folk narrative, which are, in terms of, they are myth, tale, and legend. And myths are, as I said, understood as true. Now, we have this 19th century poo-pooing awful colonialist attitude where it's like, these people understand them as true, these people understand them as sacred, and it's like, but of course we wouldn't. There's a vestige of that. We always need to be aware that there's vestiges of these kind of at the very least disdainful attitudes in our thought, and we need to sort of act appropriately in many ways. So we have myth, or fundamentally true, Märchen, tale, which are false, but they're fiction. They are entertainment. They are not false like a lie. They are false like the way fiction is not true. It's not purporting to be the events. And then there's legend, which again is really one of those, these people believe this to be true. But it's really kind of like, but for some reason what distinguishes that from myth is that myth is like sacred. This definitely happened. Legend kind of curls around the edges a little bit. Legend is more of a question than a definitive statement. It's like, this kind of thing happened. Legend is fascinating. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. One of the other ways we talk about it is that narratives that can be distinguished by virtue of the teller. And that myth is typically, because they're sacred stories, because these are fundamentally important stories and they need to be told not necessarily blindly faithful to the way that they had been told before, but with a certain amount of integrity and a certain amount of understanding of the impact of the story. They're often reserved for specialized tellers, elders. They're often reserved for being committed to text so that we don't mess them up. They're often, when they are read out loud, only certain privileged people in the community are allowed to do that reading out loud. They're that important, and so and I'm telling it. You're sitting there and you're listening. You might go, and there's things like homily and so on, which are basically the sort of expanded forms where these incredibly important truths are then wrapped up into a different kind of literary device. But for the most part, you're sitting there, you're nodding. Fairy tale, same kind of thing, really. I mean, someone has a reputation for telling it. It's often someone who's like a good storyteller because they are understood as good stories. You kind of wait for the good storytellers to come. And they might have, no one tells it the way Brian tells it. Brian, tell that story. And, well, okay. And then Brian tells it. And we all sit there and we listen to Brian. For the most part, we don't do it silently, but we do it so we're maintaining the focus on Brian. Because as long as Brian is telling the story well, we're like, okay. And so it's not unidirectional, but it isn't interfered with a huge amount. It's like, yeah, Brian. Yeah, I'm agreeing. This is great. Or like, playfully, what happens next? But, for the most part, because we know. Legend, it's not in a public setting. It's not in that place where Brian's there or we're in the church or something. It's usually like, did you hear what happened? What? And the tellers are, the teller and the listener are sort of here. They are next to each other, as it were. They're not someone clearly assuming the mantle of storyteller and someone clearly assuming the mantle of a story listener. They are just like, what's going on? And they're creating the story together, because it's like, I don't know. I was out. There's this wolf, and I think the wolf was like staring at me, and I know wolves stare. Well, what does the wolf look like? The wolf was bigger. It was bigger than you normally see, and so like an extraordinary experience is communicated. It's kind of this way, and it's like, well, what do you think happened? And you don't say to the preacher, what do you think happened, when something in the sacred narrative happens? Like, what happens next? But you'll do that with legend because you are collectively creating it. So it's done privately. It's done in a conversational style. Done together. It's a collaborative medium. And and so the same thing I talked about in terms of distinguished by teller, and same thing distinguished by audience. They are one and the same. And so we have these things, these myths, these existential narratives. They inform the worldview of the group. We have these tales. We have these things that are entertainments, and we have a whole bunch of different manners of communicating them. And then we have legends. These contestable truths. There are sort of first-person equivalents to these three. This is more my thinking as opposed to necessarily established thinking, but I think I'm more or less right. And that the first-person version of a myth is something like a testimony, like the kind of things that you might hear, again, in religious services, in AA meetings or so on, group therapy sessions where someone is telling their story, and the thing is that the story is of an extraordinary occurrence. Doesn't have to be supernatural, of course, but it could be. But extraordinary occurrence that has fundamentally changed the way they are, the way they see the world. That is that level of import, and it is done in that way. Tale, well, I mean, we're always telling stories where, like anecdotes and so on, that are very much they sort of have hit on good stories, and they're there kind of to be understood as entertainment. They're kind of the anecdotes that you just sort of sit back and let go, and then we tell legends, and these are sort of fuzzy because there's not a strict overlap, but we certainly tell legends about our own experience. We have these memorats, we have these like, I don't know what happened, and the relationship between how a first person experience becomes a third person experience, where, going back to what I was talking about, this wolf, and saying, I don't know about this wolf, someone else says, did you hear about Ian and the wolf? And it's like, I don't know what happened, but there was this wolf. And then someone else said, "Do you hear about that guy with the wolf?" And then sort of enters into it, where they're still trying to figure out what actually happened in this way. So that relationship, the memorat and fabulat. The memorat is the first person extraordinary account, and the fabulat is when it becomes part of sort of the collective. Oh, I love this tangent, but I'm going. That's a really interesting question. But they're sort of fundamentally structured in the same way. And finally, you need to remember that these categories are fluid. As I already said, myths are fundamentally true, but a lot of their structures are the same as Märchen, as tale, and you can kind of go, oh, okay, I can tell them as entertainments, and again we for many sacred or stories that were once sacred, we often tell them as good stories, and we're engaged in the Greek myths, even if we don't necessarily think too much about Jupiter and all those Greek gods. We're kind of fine. Which one's the Greek one? Zeus. Zeus is Greek. Jupiter is Latin, Roman. There we go. I'm an old man. But we can still tell them the stories, and so there's a fluidity. There's a fluidity in terms of, from each telling, I can tell them differently, but there's still that sort of set of expectations of how they go, and they are. And what was the next part? Oh, and they're fluid in terms of their generic approach, and that often once they're, and legend is another good example of this. Once they have kind of settled, they move from being legend to being not necessarily tale. Well, and not fairy tale, but it's just like they move into the level of good story. It's like I don't know. Ian tells a story about this wolf, and you just got to hear the story. And it's like, oh, there I was. And then I'm telling it as an aesthetic item. I'm not telling it as an account. I'm telling it as a structured piece of verbal art. And verbal art is one of the ways that we sometimes frame this larger context. I mean, I haven't even talked about joke telling. I haven't even talked about proverbs. We talk about proverbs and riddles a little bit later in the semester. I haven't talked about many of these things, but this idea of verbal art, that over and above the communicative function of speech, there are times when we sit back and we frame that speech in a way that is at least to a certain measure, and sometimes to a great measure, based on our aesthetic appreciation of it. It's like, what is being brought, and how are those words shaped according to the expectations of what constitutes a good story. And then sometimes, and this will lead into the reading that we're doing this week by Hearn, sometimes we take these stories and we remove them from verbal art entirely, and we remediate them in a different way, which is kind of cool. And sometimes we have to ask the question of who's the we in this situation, because whose stories are we telling? What happens when we take particular narratives and we bring them in to a different context? And we're going to be looking, Hearn's reading is about what happens when Canadian First Nations narratives are turned into cartoons. I mean, for First Nation children's audiences, but a form that has a deep meaning, not simply in terms of their content, but also in terms of the very act of storytelling. What happens when the very act of storytelling is absented and replaced with the different kind of storytelling, which is animation and television, and then syndication and a whole bunch of things. So that's it. So yeah, next time for the reading for the week is going to be on Hearn, and I'll do my little let Ian talk you through her video for this. And otherwise, we're going to keep on going. I hope you are well, and take care. Bye-bye.